Very good afternoon to all of you. Professor K.S.James, Director of IIPS, Professor Ashwini Deshpande, the guest speaker today, invitees, guests, faculty, staff, and students. It is my pleasure to welcome you all to this 14th Professor P.N.MariBhat Memorial Lecture, organized by International Institute for Population Sciences. We are very happy to have Professor Ashwini Deshpande from Ashoka University, New Delhi, who is a very well-known economist, and also her work on gender-related issues and caste-related issues are much discussed and debated, to deliver this very important lecture in honor of Professor MariBhat. Professor MariBhat was one of the finest and very distinguished demographer of our times. He was the former director of the International Institute for Population Sciences. I will take a few minutes to highlight some of his research works in this context. He obtained his Ph.D. in demography from the University of Pennsylvania under the guidance of Professor Samuel Preston, very well-known demographer. He also worked as a visiting professor in many foreign universities, but most of his research work exclusively focused on Indian demography. He was at the Center for Development Studies, Trivandrum. He also worked at the Institute for Social and Economic Change, ISEC, Bangalore. Professor MariBhat was director of the Population Research Center, Dharwad in Karnataka. Then he moved to Delhi as a professor at the Institute of Economic Growth, IEG in Delhi. And in 2005, he joined as the director of IIPS. His research work spread over many issues. He was a pioneer in estimating the fertility and mortality for colonial India, as well as the first few decades of our independence. His research work on gender issues, religion and fertility, marriage skews, widow remarriage, and also the complex relationship between female education and fertility, and many other son preference. Many other studies were well known, well quoted, and even now considered to be very authentic research work based on data and evidence. He was very particular that when he examined the contemporary issues, whether social or demographic issues, he was giving a lot of emphasis on evidence and data to argue the cases rather than anything else. So he was mainly guided by the science and the facts and the data. That is why his research contributions are even now well known, and many of us will remember his contribution as director of this institute. He took a lot of efforts to expand the institute's teaching and research curricula, developing the infrastructure, introducing new courses, and giving to its an international dimension by organizing many programs till the untimely demise that happened in 2007. So we organized this memorial lecture in honor to him, in memory of Professor MariBhat, and I'm very happy that we have Professor Ashwini Deshpande to deliver this lecture today. Now let me welcome all of you once again to this memorial lecture series. Let me now request Professor James, Director of IIPS, to chair this session, as well as introduce our guest speaker, Professor Deshpande. Thank you all, and over to Professor James.
Thank you. Thank you, Professor Sekher and Dr. Ashwini, inviters, colleagues, many faces I see, as well as students and members of the faculty of IIPS. Good afternoon and welcome to this 14th MariBhat Memorial Lecture. I think it's indeed also a great pleasure to welcome Dr. Ashwini to online mode to IIPS to deliver this lecture. Indeed, we are fortunate to have you with us today, Dr. Ashwini, because we see with so many parallels between Dr. MariBhat's work as well as your engagement in different various aspects of contemporary issues in India. Because as Professor Sekher was mentioning, MariBhat was perhaps very thorough empiricist in its fullest sense. And if you really look at Dr. Ashwini Deshpande's work over the period of time, it has really been very thorough empirical work to really understand the contemporary realities of India, whether it in terms of gender, in terms of caste, in terms of other ways of discrimination, and so on and so forth. Because it is also true that you are also a founding director of the Center for Economic and Data and Analysis at the Ashoka University. That itself shows that you are really looking at the data and trying to derive conclusions and policy relevance from such an analysis. I don't know whether I need to really introduce Dr. Ashwini, because as a scholar, she is well known all over India. She currently holding this position at the Ashoka University as the director and professor at the Center for Economic Data and Analysis. But prior to that, she has been known for her stint at the Delhi School of Economics for a longer years, during which period I presume that she has contributed two important books to this world, especially on understanding. I think the two books are so important because Grammar of Caste as well as on the affirmative actions in India, which are both are published by Oxford University Press in 2011 and 2013, which really provided sort of a real understanding of what is really the caste discrimination and how do we really look at caste discrimination through a real empirical angle. I think that these two works, the two books has been sort of a well-read and also widely publicized books, both in terms of understanding the caste and discrimination analysis in India. So in addition to that, she has wide contribution because Ashwini has started, I believe, her career working in poverty and inequality. And even before that, she has worked on international trade and so on and so forth. So it's a wide contribution in the area of economics, in the area of empirical analysis, in the area of really policy relevant studies to understand the contemporary issues. So, Dr. Ashwini, I don't want to spend much of my time on introducing. I know it will take quite a long time to introduce the vast areas of research. So it's an honor for you to be delivering this lecture. So thank you for accepting our invitation and welcome to this lecture. So let me now call upon Dr. Ashwini to deliver 14th MariBhat Memorial Lecture. Over to you, Dr. Ashwini.
Thank you. Dr. James, Director of IIPS, Dr. Sekher, other distinguished guests, friends and colleagues. Thank you for inviting me to deliver this 14th P.N. MariBhat Memorial Lecture. I'm extremely honored and humbled because Professor MariBhat was a multi-faceted, multi-talented scholar, and I don't think I quite fit the shoes, but it's certainly an honor to be, allowed to pay my tribute to Professor MariBhat in the form of this lecture. And actually, I never had the good fortune of meeting him, or I may have seen him, but I really didn't know him personally. But as I started working on a paper that I'm going to be briefly discussing today, I was really struck by his absence, because when I started working on this paper along with my former student Apurva Gupta, this was a totally new field for me. I really didn't know anything about these issues that I'm going to be talking about today. And I started reading the literature. And of course, you can't get into this literature without reading Professor MariBhat's stellar contributions. And I really wished he had been around for me to have discussed my ideas with him. Of course, I did discuss with many others, but his absence was acutely felt. Anyway, such is life, and I feel like, okay, maybe through this work, it's my little attempt to pay tribute to a person who knew much more about these topics than I do, and certainly many in the audience probably know much more about this than I do. But I'm going to share with you whatever little insight that I have on the question of son preference and gender gaps in education. So there is a phenomenon in rural Maharashtra, and in fact, Professor Sekher also has a paper on this, which I did not know, but last week he shared with me. The phenomenon is that girls are called Nakusha or Nakoshi, which in Marathi means not wanted. And it's a very stigmatizing and demeaning name, because parents are indicating to the girl right from the point of her birth that she's not wanted. After I wrote the paper and I presented it at many other conferences, I was told that this phenomenon of naming girls as unwanted is not unique to Maharashtra. For example, in Bengal, apparently, girls are named Arna or Anna. Arna means no more. And Anna is a sort of a form of that. And in Chinese, in Mandarin, also there is a word that describes this phenomenon. So in societies with strong son preference, there is a distinct notion that some girls might be unwanted, that parents basically had them when they were actually trying for a boy, but the girl ended up being born. So this was the starting point of this paper. But before we get into the details of the study, some few things that we should note, which is that when you look at gender gaps in health or educational or occupational outcomes, wages, etc., these almost all societies have some versions of these gaps in larger or smaller magnitude. So India is definitely not unique in having gender gaps in various socioeconomic outcomes. Of course, the gaps are larger in developing countries compared to developed. And the reason for that is both the fact that what are called supply and demand side factors. So both factors within the household, within the community, as well as factors on for example, in the labor market, the demand for female labor or discrimination against the girl child, or facilities, existence of schools, hostels, transportation. So all of these factors combine to produce gender gaps in education, health, and labor markets. Now, when you think of the demand side or the household side, household-based, by the way, the word demand side when it comes to education or health is typically refers to the household factors, because it's demand for education, demand for health. Whereas the term demand side, when you look at the labor market literature, is typically referred to, you refer to the employers, because they are the ones who are demanding labor. So the term is same, but the entity changes. And in particular, the household becomes the demand side actor in the context of education and health, whereas it becomes a supply side actor in the context of women, going into the labor force. Now, usually in developing countries, particularly in countries of South Asia or Middle East and North Africa, the MENA region, there is a catch-all kind of a term, son preference. And the word son preference is supposed to explain all the household level discriminatory factors that produce adverse consequences for the female child. And of course, within the developing world also, there are some countries that have a particularly acute form of son preference. India, not just India, but the subcontinent, which includes Pakistan, Nepal, and Bangladesh as well. China and South Korea are sort of the most commonly associated with a very strong son preference. So much so that it's manifested in sex-selective feticide or infanticide. And this is the phenomenon that we know widely through Amartya Sen's work as a problem of missing women. Of course, son preference is not only restricted to these few countries. You find the practice of son preference pretty widespread, even though it doesn't produce the strong, sex ratio at birth distortions of the kind that you see, for example, in India or China. Now, this background is well known, and I have not said anything that the audience here did not know already, but I want to discuss a few of the results of a new paper that I have with my former student, Apurva Gupta, who's now assistant professor in Ramjas College in Delhi University. So what we did, basically, we wanted to look at how gender gaps in education have changed between 1986 and 2018. And could we, through the data, could we actually assess whether and to what extent the change in the gender gaps is due to son preference, or are there other competing explanations? So this was our idea in this paper. And because it is data over 3 decades, we all know that there is son preference, we know that there are gender gaps in education, and it is, when I say education, it could be the quantity of schooling, it could be the quality, and in fact, I'll tell you what the outcome measures we look at. And the purpose of this exercise was to check whether a period of 3 decades, which has been marked by extensive structural changes in the Indian economy, and therefore has changed the pattern of supply and demand for education, for example, because this is the paper concerned with education, what that has done to gaps, and what that has done to the motivation for the gaps from the household level. So is it, first, have the gaps intensified or muted, and whether, to what extent son preference has played a role in explaining these gaps. Now, when you look at aggregate gaps, so just proportion of girls who have finished high school, for example, a proportion of boys of that age group that have finished high school, it is not only a function of household level factors. So there is the demand side factors or the household level factors, but there's also the supply side factors. And both together would explain the gender gaps. We are well aware of that. But in this particular paper, we are focusing mainly on the household level factors, or what are called in the education literature, what would be called the demand side factors. Now, first things first, which is that when families that have a very strong son preference, they would take active steps to proactively change the composition of their children. So sex selective infanticide or feticide. What this means is that when you observe a particular family with a given number of children, with whatever the sex composition is, it is possible, highly possible, that sex composition is after the sex selective abortions or sex selection has already taken place. Now, there is no way for any survey data to determine whether any given family has engaged in sex selection or not. It is impossible. So when you look at data, household level data, to look at son preference, nobody is going to be able to check whether the household actively altered the sex composition of their children or not. Right? Some people have looked at the gaps between children, but it's I think very inaccurate to attribute any long gap to abortion. There could be multiple reasons why there's a long gap. There could be miscarriage. There could be just, the woman didn't get pregnant. Anything could have happened to produce a long gap. So basically, the first thing that we have to remember is that when we see the families in the data that we have on from surveys, what we see is what we see. That's all we know. We don't know whether the existing composition is after sex selective abortions. So all we have to work with in terms of our estimation are the non-missing women. Because the missing women, in other words, the female fetuses that were not allowed to be born, they don't get born. And so those women are not in our data set, not in anybody's data set. So, to sum up what I said already, what we see in the data are actual number of children, and there is no way that we can tell whether parents consciously manipulated the size and sex composition of their families. We all know that prenatal sex determination is illegal, but it thrives. So to get around this issue of estimation, we followed the methodology that was discussed in the Economic Survey of 2017. 2018, sorry. If you recall, that particular economic survey had, for the first time, a chapter on gender. And they used the methodology suggested by Seema Jayachandran's paper in 2017 that identified a phenomenon called meta-son preference. What is meta-son preference? Which is that these are families that have a son preference, and they may resort to sex selection also, but whether or not they resort to sex selection, basically they adopt a fertility stopping rule, which means you keep on having children till at least one son or the desired number of sons is born. So one of the ways of telling whether there is such a family is there should be one or two girls or three girls, and then there is a son, and then no more, or two sons and no more. So the last born will typically be a son. And when there is no such rule, then the sex ratio at birth will be 1.05, which is 105 boys children to 100 girl children, regardless of whether the child is the last one or not. Okay, but when you have this meta-son preference and the fertility stopping rule, then the sex ratio of the last child is heavily skewed towards boys, and the sex ratio of earlier children is heavily skewed towards girls. Right? So if it was just a question of somebody wanted just 4 children, and so they had 1, 2, 3 girls and then 1 boy, it could be just that they wanted 4 children. The sex of the child was determined by nature, and they really didn't do anything consciously to keep on producing children till they finally got a son and stopped. If this was what everybody was doing, then at every birth order, the sex ratio should have been 1.05. But when you have meta-son preference, which means a phenomenon of unwanted girls, which means parents keep having children till at least 1 boy is born, then the sex ratio of the last child is heavily skewed towards boys, and the sex ratio of earlier children is heavily skewed towards girls. That, when you find that at an aggregate level in society, you could say that there is meta-son preference, and unwanted girls are getting born. In other words, these are girls that would not have been born if the boy had just been born earlier. Parents wouldn't have even tried for another child. Okay. So these are girls that are born in the process of parents trying for a boy. Now, I'm going to just stop here to explain that, whenever I presented this paper, the use of the word unwanted, people say, oh, no, but, parents love all their children, etc. This is not about love or parents not loving their children. Parents love their children. Once you get the child, regardless of whether originally you wanted a girl or a boy, whichever child is born, parents do love their children. So this is not a claim to say that parents don't love their children. All it is that for a variety of reasons, I'll talk about those later, which we all know, patriarchality, ritual reasons, old age support, etc. For all of these reasons, there is a need for a boy child. And unwanted girls only means that parents keep on trying till they get a boy. And how do we tell that in the aggregate? In any one family, you can't tell. But in the aggregate, how do you tell that? You look at the sex ratio at every birth order. That's the way to identify meta-son preference. So we said, okay, we will start with that framework. And what we did was we started with families with a birth order of 3. Why birth order of 3? Because total fertility rate is now at 2.1 on the aggregate. So, it's at replacement level. So on average, Indian families are having 2 children. So if they have more than 2 children, you could say that there might be a phenomenon of unwanted girls. Of course, we realize that it could happen earlier as well. So this is not a 100% perfect methodology, but it's something to go with. And so what did we do? Supposing we observe in our data that starting with 3 or more children, families that have 3 or more children, if the last child is a boy and all preceding children are girls, then we call these families mixed families with unwanted girls. Okay. So supposing you have 3 children, then it would be G, G, and B. That would be the order. If you had n children, then it would be G, 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 G till n-1, and then last, the nth child will be a boy. Okay. Supposing last child is not a boy, then we call it, and there are girls and boys in the family, then we call it mixed families, just with no unwanted children. It's just, mixed family. And of course, there are families with only boys, and there are families with only girls. So basically, there are 4 types of families that you observe in the data. Only boys, only girls, mixed families without unwanted girls, and mixed families with unwanted girls. That's the way we classify them. And so in these 4 types of families, basically there are 6 types of children. A child could be a boy in an all-boys family. A child could be a boy in a mixed family with no unwanted girls. Or a child could be a boy in a mixed family with unwanted girls. So B_mix is a boy in a mixed family with no unwanted girls, and B_U_W is a boy in a mixed family with unwanted girls, and the same thing for girls as well. So basically, a child is male or female at birth, and this male or female child could could be classified according to the family type that they are born into. This is just empirical. This is just what we find in data, and that's what we classify them. Okay. Now, again, to repeat, because again, this question comes up a lot, which is how do you know that they're unwanted? Of course, we don't know. We can't peep into the minds of every family that is in the data set and ex post ask if these families wanted these girls or not. Okay. So all we observe are ex post number of children and not the ex ante desires of parents. So with observational data, it is impossible for anyone to determine with absolute certainty whether a particular girl is wanted or unwanted. Okay. So what you observe in the data is the ex post number of and the gender mix of children, which is a function of what the desired family size is, how many children the parents wanted, how strong their son preference is, as well as sheer luck. You may keep wanting a boy, but you might try 4 times girls, and then you don't try anymore. So it's just for that kind of a family, I would say it's bad luck. For me personally, that would be good luck. Having 4 girls sounds like a lot of fun for me. But, for some other family, it might say, oh, bad luck that you got 4 girls. So, it's nature, it's the strength of the son preference, and it's how many children the families wanted. So all you observe is what the outcome, right? Now, any of these families could be families with unwanted girls, not obviously all boys families, but even the family with only girls those girls could also have been unwanted originally. Supposing if parents wanted only 2 children, for whatever reason, they didn't want more than 2 children. They tried twice, both the children turned out to be girls. They wanted a boy, but they had decided already that they would not have more children over and above 2. So in principle, those 2 girls are also unwanted in the sense that the parents would have preferred a boy, but we don't classify them as unwanted because of the rule that we have adopted. So we recognize that our classification of families with unwanted girls is a lower bound estimate. There could be other families that we don't classify as families with unwanted girls that could also have girls that are unwanted, right? So this point I already made. Or even parents who first have a girl and then a boy might have wanted both boys, but stop after the boy because they didn't want a 3rd child, right? So even though the 2-child families are not included in our data set, so this family would not be counted as a family with unwanted girls, but that could also be the case. But since our estimates are lower bounds, as empirical, as people who work with data, that is not a problem because we can say that if we find this level of disparity or discrimination, the actual discrimination would only be greater. So what we produce are lower bound estimates of the effect of son preference. So what data do we use? we use the 4 special educational surveys from the National Sample Survey. These are special rounds of the NSS that are conducted to gauge educational outcomes. So 86, 87, that's 42nd round, 95, 96, 52nd round, 2014, which is 71st round, and 2017, 18, which is the 75th round. And they have about 77, 72, 65. So it's a large number of households, basically. So it is representative at the all India level and certainly also at the state level. Now, the other caveat, which again, those of you who work with unit level data know this, that in a survey roster, in a household roster, relationships are typically identified with respect to the head of the household. So we can only identify the biological children of the head of the household. And so if there are three couples and their children in a household, we can only identify the one that is identified as so we only use biological children of the head of the household. So that's the other issue data. And so what we look at are nuclear families of the household head. By nuclear, they could be nuclear or joint. I don't mean living together, but literally the household head, the spouse of the household head, and their children. That's really what we look at. Of course, this gives rise to selection concerns, that are we taking a very selective sample and therefore none of this is going to be representative of so we have so there are selection concerns, and in the paper we address many of those selection concerns, but here is one slide to show you how the family composition has changed. So for the 4 rounds of data, what we have plotted are families with 1 child, which is a boy, families with 1 child, which is a girl, families with 2 children, 2 children, 2 girls, 2 children mixed, 3 or more all boys, 3 or more all girls, 3 or more mixed, 3 or more unwanted, using our classification. And what you see is this dark maroon bar, which is 3 or more mixed families. That proportion over time is going up. All right. 1 child families are also going up. But these both 1 child boy families and 1 child girl families, but the proportion of 1 child boy families going up is, the percentage is larger in every round, and the increase is larger. 2 children mixed families, this turquoise teal color, this also is actually going up, right? And 2 children boys. So there is some change in the type of families that people are having. What does it do to our results? Well, relative to 3 child families, 1 child families, the proportion is steadily increasing. And in the 1 child families, mothers are more educated, mothers are younger, fathers are older. These are more urban families and more female headed. So these are the kinds of families that end up having 1 child compared to 3 children. And they are richer also. So we've classified families into monthly per capita expenditure quartiles, and these happen to be the top quartile, more at the top end of the expenditure distribution. And the 2 children families also are, more urban, mothers more educated, fathers more educated, younger mothers, etc. So all of these attributes. So yeah, the 2 and 1 child families are different from the 3 child families. But for reasons that we go into the paper, this doesn't negate our results. It doesn't put a question mark on the results that we get from our 3 child families. So again, to go back, in the paper, we elaborate a lot on why the selection concerns, even though the family composition over time has changed, it does not really affect our results. We look at all biological children of the head of the household and the spouse in the age group of 6 to 19 years, because we are looking at schooling. We also look at mothers over 35. Why? Because in India, it's very very small proportion of mothers have children over 35. So most of the childbearing is actually over by the time the mother reaches 35. And if we just keep our sample to that category of mothers, again, it's a smaller sample, standard errors are larger, but all results go through. So we've done a bunch of robustness checks in our paper as well. What are the gaps that we are looking at? One is the quantity of schooling. So either a child was ever enrolled in school or currently enrolled. We look at years of education simply, just looking at an OLS estimation. We look at quality of schooling. Did the child go to a private school? Did the child go to an English medium school? And of course, we can combine. So was the child sent to a private English medium school, which is more expensive? We look at the probability of that. And then we look at expenditure on education, because this data set has that information. But of course, this is relevant only on the child currently being enrolled. So we do a Heckman two-stage probit to look at conditional on child being currently enrolled. What are the gaps in educational expenditure between girls and boys? And this data set also talks about stream choice. So when you go up higher into the educational stream, when you go into the high school, at the high school level, you're supposed to take either arts or science, etc. So we look at three broad buckets: arts or humanities, science, which are the STEM subjects, and we look at commerce. Now, these are not parental decisions necessarily. I mean, I know that Indian parents tend to guide their children much more, but the child could also decide depending on what the friends are doing, peer pressure, teachers, quality of education in the school. Lots of factors go into the decision that young adults make about going into these streams. But if it is a society with heavily discriminatory attitudes against girls, then we believe that will get reflected indirectly into stream choice as well. So that's why we also look at indirect consequences of parental societal attitudes and look at stream choice. So I'm just giving you the summary of the results. So first of all, in the quantity variables, ever enrolled, currently enrolled, years of education. Over the year of our study, 1985-86 to 2018, the gender gaps are eliminated, zero, over time. So, and this is true of girls, boys born in any of the families. So overall, if you look at all girls and look at all boys, you see a convergence, and you see a convergence in each of the family types as well. So whatever the other consequences of son preference or unwanted girls might be, it is certainly not in the quantity of education. Okay? But in the quality of education, and how do you measure quality of education? We measure it by private schooling, because private schooling requires a greater educational expenditure. There's also tuitions, uniforms, there's just more expenditure on the child who's going to a private school. Gender gaps in private schooling have increased over the period under consideration. And the largest increase we see in families with unwanted girls, in the mixed families with unwanted girls. Expenditure gap, not just, so quality of education just measures the probability that the child would be sent to a private school. Expenditure is literally in monetary terms, we look at expenditure. And this again has increased over the period. Most of the increase is between 1995 and 2014. So the post-liberalization years. So the years, the aspirational India years, where, and our interpretation of this is that the girls are unwanted, so you send them to school, but parents would not spend on high quality education for them. And expenditure is not just school fees, it's also tuition, it's uniforms, other books, etc. It's all kinds of resources for education. It's driven by families with unwanted girls. But it is also, you also see that in families with no unwanted girls, mixed families. So parents, even if they are not discriminating actively against the girl child, they put their money on the child most likely to succeed, which in a patriarchal society like India is the boy child. So what we find is evidence on the intensification of meta-son preference, which has adversely affected the quality of schooling for unwanted girls. Now, so these are the main results. There are many other smaller results, and there's much more detail about the results in the paper. But this is the sort of a broad preview. This is the main headline result anyway of the paper. Now, just to put these results in context and for some discussion, first of all, as we all know here, all those of us who are here, we know that India is actually an ideal setting to examine how son preference has changed over time, particularly as the economy liberalized and we saw some degree of structural change, because the presence of very strong son preference is obvious in the skewed sex ratio at birth. So that fact is not disputed. So India is indeed a good setting to examine these changes. While this is true, on the other hand, at least in the first 2 decades of liberalization, India grew at a fairly fast rate, which led to a lot of structural changes. New jobs got created, greater urbanization happened, migration, interstate migration increased. There was a greater diversity in the sources of livelihoods. And at least early, this is all pre-COVID, obviously, there was a movement away from traditional farming occupation. So a lot of churning in the economic sphere in India. And, obviously that would all have impact on the, fortunes of girl and female and male children. At the same time, various schemes that the governments, central as well as many state governments, started at enhancing the value of the girl child. So subsidies, monetary incentive, changes in inheritance laws, the Ladli Yojana in Delhi, similar such yojanas in practically all states of India, plus, very vigorous media campaigns about the girl being as valuable as the boy, Beti Bachao, Beti Padhao, from 2014 onwards, etc. So the messaging, at least in terms of the official statements, is, during this period certainly was very clear that we wanted a society that would give equal opportunities to the girl child, certainly in the field of education. So, there's been all this happening, but the question is, what do we find as the outcome? Now, in countries like China and North Korea, the state played a very important role in fostering explicit, targeted state-sponsored interventions, right? But those countries have a different political setting, and it's not always possible, or neither, may not be even desirable, to replicate those strategies in democracies like India. But there is an example of South Korea, which in many ways is similar to India, which is South Korea also saw rapid structural change since 1991. Which led to a disintegration of pre-industrial social organization and rapid urbanization, increasing female education. And this part is similar to India, but the one part that's different is that in South Korea, we also saw a rapid increase in female labor force participation rates. As a result of which, the relationship between the parents and their children changed in certain key dimensions. How? Because more and more women entered the workforce and were in paid employment, women were seen as economically just as capable as the sons were to provide old age support. So one of the biggest material basis for son preference, which is old age support, that changed because the economic value of daughters changed. Daughters were also now valuable and could give old age support to their fathers, to their parents, just as the sons could. And because of urbanization and migration, in South Korean society, what started to happen was the child who was the closest, the offspring that was the closest to the parents, that offspring ended up providing greater support. So if the daughter was closer, then she would provide more support to their parents compared to the son. So both of these factors undercut the material basis for son preference in the South Korean economy. And Monica Dasgupta has a couple of papers at least documenting this phenomenon. Okay. So what's happening in India? Is it old-fashioned discrimination or what? So first, when we look at the gaps in the increasing gaps in the quality of education, we see that they are driven by families with a meta-son preference. Those are the families with unwanted girls. So one explanation could be, okay, this is just old-fashioned discrimination. Why? Because one is, in India, marriage continues to be nearly universal. And patrilocality continues to be the norm, which is the girl will go into the household of the husband, right? And so this sustains the notion that the girl from the time she's born is a pariah dhan, somebody else's a property. And so why would parents invest in pariah dhan, or a treasure that belongs to somebody else? So as somebody famously wrote, it is like watering a neighbor's garden. Why would you do that, right? So patrilocality and near universality of marriage could be one reason why you see this clear gender gap, increase in gender gap in the quality of education. That could be one reason. And of course, the dowry system continues, and so there's deep-rooted pressure of generating a dowry. So while girls have to be educated in terms of quantity, in fact, now you have educational hypogamy rather than educational hypergamy. In other words, boys marrying, men marrying women with greater educational achievement compared to themselves. But the quality of education of girls is definitely poorer compared to boys on an average in families with 3 or more children. So this, of course, points to the old-fashioned son preference, gender discrimination story. But maybe there is, and Professor MariBhat's work also points to this channel. Okay. What we'd like to suggest in this paper, that it's the explanation is a little more complicated. I think we think that there are winds of change. First of all, we find that boys are more likely to be sent to private schools than compared to girls. So one way to interpret this would be, oh, this is just discrimination. The other way to interpret this is that most state governments now have schemes where if the girl child is sent to the government school, she gets benefits. So either a scholarship or uniforms or, bicycle, for example, in Bihar, etc. So it makes more sense for parents to send the daughter to the government school because she's going to get. So it might just be just a very, rational cost calculation rather than discrimination. That's one factor. The other is, again, Professor MariBhat has an excellent paper talking about this, which is the decline in total fertility rate. So whether you look at the two censuses, 2001 and 2011, whether you look at the sample registration survey system figures and most latest NFHS 5 figures, you in fact see that urban TFR is now below replacement, rural TFR is 2.1, overall it's 2.1, 2, something like that. So, there is total fertility rate has been declining in India for a while. Okay. There's also been increase in sex ratio at birth. It's still not optimal, and it's very highly uneven. If you look at NFHS 4 versus NFHS 5, most states have improved. Some states have also regressed. So, it's a rocky road. But the change is slow, the change is uneven. But on aggregate at the national level, the change is in the correct direction. We still need to reach 952 girls to 1,000 boys. We are still at 929, but it's better than 918, and it's better than the 800s that many states had before. So overall, the movement is in the correct path. Okay, so these are also stylized facts that we need to remember. Also, in many qualitative studies, you see the emergence of a new type of gender stereotype, which is that of caring daughters and unreliable sons, especially after marriage. So many fieldwork-based studies talk about how parents said the son is a useless person, doesn't care about us. It's the daughter who's willing. And in Bangladesh, actually, this comes up very strongly in fieldwork. So maybe the gender stereotype about who can provide old age support, that itself is also changing. Now, if India managed to increase female labor force participation rate, then in fact we would be like the South Korean story, where women would be valued for their economic contributions. So we have all other pieces, but we don't have this piece that led to a fundamental change in terms of a weakening of son preference in India. We are not there yet, but there are factors that are leading there. All right. The second thing that we need to remember is strategies that families adopt for social mobility. First, growth, development, structural changes, etc. They don't automatically eliminate gender discrimination, not in India, not in other countries as well. All right. So there is an argument, Ravinder Kaur, etc. have made it, which is that families might be resorting to this two-child norm, sex selection at birth, to make sure that at least one of the children is a boy, to make sure that the children achieve upward mobility so that they are able to reach a level higher than the occupational or status level of their parents. So educational investments in, more in the boys relative to the girls could be, or this meta-son preference could be an element of the upward mobility strategy of the new elite in India, which is have small families, focus on the children's success, aspire for at least one son, and to make sure that that son is successful, spend more on that son's education relative to the boys, relative to the girls. Of course, all this paper was, we had done most of the work on the paper before COVID. There are, now it's ready and we'll send it off to journals, etc. But post-COVID, even this quantity gap story might change. In fact, there's a lot of evidence to suggest that prolonged school closures for 2 years and the lack of access to smartphone devices, the lack of possibilities of online learning has disproportionately negatively impacted girls' education relative to boys. There are anecdotal accounts of early marriages, so that would put a serious question mark over all of these results that we find. However, pre-COVID, our result is basically that the manifestation of son preference in terms of educational gaps of surviving girls is really in the form of quality of education, not so much in the form of quantity of education. So I will end there. This is the selection slide. And let me stop sharing my screen. I hope I stuck to my time.
Yeah. Thank you, Dr. Ashwini. I think it was very wonderful way of looking at the data. I think often we look at aggregates, but there is no other option, but we have to look at aggregates in issues like sex ratio, but there are also nuances of it, which you have really clearly brought out in this presentation. Also looking at arguing that, perhaps when we see that quantitatively things are bettering, convergence is taking place, and there is also areas of divergence which is happening. I think that's also a big message. One has to really see what are the areas now, because most of the surveys, even the quantitative surveys like NFHS, still continues to capture the quantitative dimensions. So we also need to go beyond that to really start capturing many of the dimensions we have not explored so far, especially in areas of gender discrimination. I think that's also is a very important message which your paper gives for your talk gives us. No, I'm also was intrigued by the fact that whether you also raised an important question, whether government policies itself can be more discriminatory, because if the government policy is telling that being in the government public institutions, you will get some benefits for a particular gender composition. Naturally, that will also induce the parents to send the female girl children to public schools and boys to the private schools. That's itself government policy also may need to have a relook whether there are areas of concerns in these policies in itself. I think overall, I think you have given so much of ideas, so much to think about, so much to contemplate. I think thank you so much. I'm sure we will take few questions. I hope you will have some time to take questions. Yeah. You are free to ask questions in the chat box. You have at the right side the chat box. You can ask questions, or in case you can also unmute and ask, but that is only one by one. We will start taking questions one by one. So I right away see Professor Gulati is raising his hand. So let me first start with Professor Gulati.
No. Let me compliment first Ashwini, for very interesting, presentation. But this is a kind of debatable issue. If I take, way back to historical, kind of studies on bird fertility survey, you must have gone through that also because you are analyzing a lot of data from NSS round 45 and all 4 rounds of data you have said. When we did that, because I did, a kind of study with my Bob Rutherford at that time, and I was analyzing NFHS3 data at IIPS, and we came out with a joint book on contraception also. So son preference was also an issue which we have developed, in that particular book also. So when you look at the World Fertility Survey data, and if you look at the son preference was prevalent all over European countries, African countries, America, everywhere, excepting 2 countries. That was Venezuela and Costa Rica. Excepting 2 countries, son preference was revealed in all the bird fertility surveys data in all the countries. Of course, we didn't go for the bird fertility survey, but then we went for the other kind of survey. Now, 2 quick questions, because there are a lot of interesting issues which you have raised on which I can go, because even look at the sex ratio at birth, because that is also getting disturbed because of the feticide, which feticide in the sense of female feticide. But if you look at the data, otherwise also the antenatal care increase also improves sex ratio at birth. When I'm talking males per 105 males. And optimally, you also refer to 952 females for 1000 male births. But in natural course also, the male fetuses are lost more than the female fetuses. That is how we call female is a biologically, stronger, gender out of the 2. Quick question to you, because this I raised even, to Amartya Sen also when he was talking in Population Council sector, and he said that women education is more important compared to the female labor force participation. And then he just came out with his own, his style, and he took it up. Now in presentation you said that when you look at the kind of factors apart from quality, quantity versus, I don't think we have time to go into that. But when you look at the kind of factors like urbanization or modernization or female labor force participation, or you call it, quality of education, whatever. Suppose I ask you that out of these 3 or 4 or 5 factors which you must have analyzed from your analysis or data, which factor is most important for, if I look at this relative significance, which is most important for reducing the son preference in Indian society? Because that is a policy implication also. Because if you really go to the Niti Aayog or you go to Planning Commission or go to Ministry also, they certainly ask these kind of questions. And even MDC, Minal Datta Chaudhary, you quoted Monica Das Gupta. MDC also, asked this question that if I strict, that moment you get a son, you stop family. Then I said, very simple answer, that's a binomial distribution. Whatever may be if you're not tinkering with sex ratio at birth, the sex composition of the population is not going to change. So coming to specific question, Ashwini, out of the 3-4 factors, out of your expertise, what would you say which is most important for reducing son preference in Indian society?
Okay. Ashwini, would you like to take a few more questions? And
Yeah, let me collect a few and then maybe answer it together. Yeah.
Okay. Okay. Over to Professor Mishra.
Yeah, thank you very much, Dr. Ashwini. Actually, it's a very exciting talk, and I would not engage with the conventional debate on sex ratio, but what 2 interesting facets that you exposed in this paper really impressed me a lot because it's important that one is unwantedness. the concept of unwantedness that you have brought in. The concept of unwantedness is to be seen, as you have seen, is its incidence and also intensity. I am more interested in the fact that you have got its incidence, you have actually defined it. I'm not going to contest the way you have defined it. But underlying that, as a demographer, I must say that there is something called differential stopping, which is playing the role, and that you have captured. When you capture unwantedness, I was getting a little worried about one thing. When you have grouped these households and you say that this is the case of unwantedness. Let me put this question to you straight. That if you say measure of unwantedness has to be ranging from 0 to 1, incidence is fine. We have to have this unwantedness across households. Whether there were all girl household, whether there was all boys household, conceptually you have defined so interesting. It was very, very, impressive to me that, this is the new facet that you are bringing in. And it's important to say, what is the extent? Can we categorize households? All are culprits in the process. I say that I get 2 boys with differential stopping. I'm also a culprit of sex ratio distortion. As much as, somebody who gets 3 girls with all failures of not getting a boy. That is one dimension that I wanted some reflection from you. The second dimension is also most interesting when we relate to education. I should tell you that this conflict between incentivization for girls' education, which is actually not only bringing convergence into our quantum, but also explicitly dividing the quality. The Tamil Nadu data actually some time back for the Secretary of Tamil Nadu I had analyzed. Public school education is completely in terms of girls, rural, and then you find the concentration in public schools, government schools. So government and private divide is actually is one thing which needs to be elaborated by us, as Professor James rightly told. Our government policies are in contestation with the ideas that we are looking for in terms of quality and quantity governance. Thanks a lot, Ashwini. It's wonderful, and I think I enjoyed the talk. I would look forward to your reactions.
Thank you.
Can I come?
Please go ahead. Yeah, sure. This is the last one. After that, we'll take answer from Ashwini, then go back to the next round.
I also like to congratulate Professor Deshpande for such a nice lecture on gender issues. Basically, you have used, I have few points which I wanted to share. You can keep in your mind about this thing. You have used the data from the education statistics. And here, one factor is that we have already those who have in the schools, they are taken into account. So the children who have already died are the negligence of the family for them. Already they are ignored. So one component is missing from that. So alive children, you are discussing about those children who are live. And the second component, when you have said about the percentage of 2 children families, girls families or boys families, those are increasing. If you look at the mortality differences over the period which you have considered, and now the gender differences in mortality have decreased. Previously it was there. Gender differences in mortality. Maybe that is also reflected in that. The second point which I wanted to tell you about is the investment on the girl children. It's not only on the education, skills, transfer of skill, transfer of business, all those things. If you look at, there is a specific difference with boys and girls. You will not find it same behavior, same thing. With so many millions of property also, people not treat the girls equally. And there are 2 things for this thing. One is dowry, because they are spending so much money. We are not talking so much about dowry, how to decrease the dowry, what should be done on the dowry. We are taking only one component about the sex selective abortions or the unwanted girls and all those things. But the main one culprit is also dowry. The second one is about the family support. And one point you have said that children spend more money on the person who is doing well. But what if you look at the current scenario, the child who is not so well settled, that person is taking the care of the parents. those who have done good education, everything, they are outside, they are not around the parents. And the people who have not done well in their studies, are not done well in the jobs, they are very close to the parents. So this is also starting something new phenomena with parents' expectation that we should give good education to the children, then only they will take care of them. That is also changing over the period of time. Okay, I don't want any answer. These are my comment and solutions. Thank you very much.
Okay, thank you. Yeah, Dr. Ashwini, you may.
All right. Yeah. So thank you, all three of you, for your comments and questions. So, the trouble with this paper is there's a lot in it, and since I didn't really present the paper, but only highlight some of the summaries, a lot of the devil is in the detail. But let me just make a few points. That first of all, this particular paper is looking at educational gaps of children who are between 6 to 19, people who are between 6 to 19 years old. That is the data set. When I'm looking at this question, there is no suggestion at all to say that other aspects of gender discrimination are not important. I have myself worked on many other aspects of gender discrimination, but a given paper must have, every paper cannot cover everything. So this paper has a specific purpose, which is to look at educational gaps. So, so thank you, for reminding me, and I think we should all remind each other constantly that education is not the only field, and years of education is not the only dimension that we should be looking at. And I absolutely agree. But this particular paper is on education only. That's my argument. And because it's a very long paper with lots of empirical details, you can't include all outcomes. It's not possible in every paper. So that's about that. The second thing is that because it contains, the data set contains, family, parents and children, their biological children who are between 6 to 19 years of age. So therefore, we can only look at up to high school or maximum early college, right? So yes, of course, there's brain drain, highly educated doctors, engineers, they go abroad, etc., etc. But we can't capture that. And NSS, remember that this paper is an empirical paper based upon NSS survey data. So it can only examine variables that are present in the NSS survey. I don't think that's a limitation. I think every survey is very rich, just as NFHS is very rich. NSS has its own strengths. Other surveys, IHDS, have their own strengths. And I think as empirical researchers, we should look at the strengths of every survey data and try to bring out what is, some features NFHS brings out, some features NSS brings out, some other features IHDS brings out, and so on and so forth. So, that at least that's the way I approach the thing. So that's that. On the quest, and this paper, as would have been clear, this is not really on the sex ratio at all. This is not a paper on the sex ratio. This is not a paper that examines sex selective. I'm not qualified to do that. This survey is not qualified to give those answers. So, this paper is about educational gaps. And the new thing about this paper, if that is new, the new thing about this paper is that it is bringing in the concept of unwantedness in some way, which is discussed in the literature. There's a lot of field work that suggests the phenomenon that parents try for children in the hope of one boy or X number of boys, etc. And whether a boy gets born or a girl gets born is nature, right? So it is using this phenomenon and trying to see whether there are any systematic differences between girls and boys, depending on whether they are born in this kind of a family or that kind of a family. This is the purpose of this paper, right? Now, this brings me to Dr. Mistra's question about unwantedness, incidence versus motivation. And I think that's a very interesting question. And unfortunately, I would really appreciate any insights into how I can go further than what I've done. Unfortunately, the best you can do is
you can definitely can. Good. You can go forward.
Further, okay. So I'd like to. I'll discuss with you offline, and we can discuss this, because this is the way that we thought of bringing in the notion of unwantedness and classifying families. But I'm very, very open to the idea of doing it some other way, and so I'll set up a time with you, and maybe we can just have a one-on-one call and do that. Now, it is absolutely true that by the time we observe families with children who are between 6 to 19, there could have been, might have been sex-selective abortions prior to that. Of course, but there is, in observational data, you can't tell that. All you observe when the surveys, I mean, you do NFHS, you know this. So when your surveys are going to the field and observing a family, you see mother, father, children, you collect a household roster, that's all you know. You can ask about history of childbirth. You can ask about history of abortion, which this survey doesn't. I know that NFHS does. You may get a truthful response. You may not. I mean, there are issues. In any case, I'm not an expert on determining how you can determine whether a particular abortion or a particular miscarriage was deliberately sex selective versus, I mean, I'm sure that there are ways of doing it, but I'm not that person. I'm not qualified to do that. But so this is, yes, it is true that this is only looking at living children. Correct. Absolutely. And the part of discrimination that has happened before, it is not capturing. But that is why I make it very, very clear to qualify these results as a lower bound. Now, as economists, we don't see lower bound as a problem. Because if you say the problem is this large, and we are saying this is a lower bound, and then you say, okay, lower bound means it could be larger. We are not overestimating the problem. We are underestimating it. So as a society or as scholars, we must recognize that whatever estimates we get from this paper, the actual problem is larger than this. The actual problem of gender discrimination and the phenomenon of unwanted girls is definitely larger than what we have been able to capture. But again, as empirical economists, it's not a limitation. It's a caveat. Every caveat is not a limitation of the paper. This is a caveat, and as long as we are aware of this caveat, that's we need to be aware of that. In terms of Professor Gulati, your question about what other structural factors are responsible for these gaps. Again, because this estimation is done on the household survey, all we can observe are parental decisions, right? We control for, state fixed effects, district, all, etc., etc. We control for all that. So if, all the features that are common to the cross-sectional unit, those are being controlled for. But if you ask me, what are the supply side factors, in other words, urbanization versus government policy versus all that this methodology cannot, and it's not meant to. Again, personally, I think if there are demand side and supply side factors explaining something, if you focus on even one of the aspects, I think that's okay. I mean, labor force participation, you cannot focus on every demand and every supply side factor in one paper. But again, I don't see that personally as a limitation. Having said that, whatever I'm set out to do, how can I do that better? I would really, I'm very, very open to those ideas. So whether it is urbanization, whether it is this, that, or the other, maybe all of those factors play a role. All I was saying was that these changes have happened at the time when urbanization rates have gone up. The first 2 decades of this period were definitely decades of high growth, of rapid structural change, which in the last period from 2012, 13, 14 onwards, that has slowed down. Growth rates have slowed down. There have been other, then 2016 was demonetization, then GST, etc. There have been other economic shocks. Then, of course, there's COVID. That's another story altogether. But there have been 2 big negative shocks between 2014 and 2018, right? So those are other sort of supply side factors or more structural factors. But what this paper does is look at household level determinants of gender gaps in education and whether these determinants vary across families of different types. That is the purpose of this paper.
Thank you. I think there are a few more questions. So, because I see long write-up from Shireen. Shireen, can you unmute and ask questions? Because I'm really not able to read it fully in a small screen. Shireen, would you like to come in?
Yeah,
Yeah,
really
please.
a great presentation. I work a lot on young people, and I did a recent, not so recent, pre-pandemic survey of girls in Rajasthan and their parents, and looking at what are the obstacles to higher education, vocational training, entering the labor force, career aspirations. So it was a mixed method study, and we looked at girls and their mothers. And what was very clear is the way that the gender system seems to condition aspirations, so that girls, by and large, over half the girls continue to have very traditional aspirations for work that could be combined with living in a traditional marital home. And so it made us think, what do we do to break those norms? What do we do to allow aspirations to flourish, whether they are relating to education or to work? And so I was thinking, in the context of what you said, how was South Korea different? How did it? How was it able to break through these notions of, letting girls go out will affect family izzat, and girls' safety will be at stake, and all those issues that inhibit girls from entering the labor force or doing anything in higher education? Thanks.
Yeah, thanks, Shireen. First of all, thank you for attending. And, it's very thrilling for me to see all these names, all of you whose papers I've read and whose work I've cited, to be at this talk. So, I'm very, very humbled. I am not an expert on South Korea by any means, but whatever little I've read, it seems like it's a bit like a Bangladesh, in the sense that the creation of paid employment opportunities for women, that was the push. So when Bangladesh went from 3% to 27%, it wasn't a prior change in the way households think or norms or whatever that pushed the girls out. It was the other way. When women went out, that then started to shift some of the norms inside the home. And so as I was saying, one big difference between the South Korean story and our story is the lack of paid opportunities for women, not too far from their homes, because it is traditional norms in terms of domestic chores, in terms of sharing of household, still are very strong, and it'll take a while before those change. But I think that it's a little bit of a chicken and egg problem, or a vicious cycle. And I think that the vicious cycle can start to weaken. Break is probably a too hopeful a word, but it'll start to weaken once there is a pull, which pulls women out into jobs. Because even when you think of education, for example, the same kind of social constraints that operate for labor market participation also actually operate for college education. Girls are interacting with boys, they have to take public transportation, there is the concern with safety, etc., etc. But girls are studying in many, many classrooms in colleges. Girls, in fact, outnumber boys. It's not even 50-50 anymore. So there is I think there is aspiration. Of course, there are pockets where aspirations may be muted or limited. But overall, I think that girls, certainly in tier 1, tier 2 cities, you see that a lot. And I think what will shift is the presence of opportunities. So education levels are going up of women, but not labor force participation. And that's really a paradox when you think about it. And it's not that they are not joining the labor force because they're still studying. No, even after they've completed their education. Because in the meanwhile, their aspirations have gone up. And NREGA job is not the only option that they are considering. If you get a class 12 or a BA education, you don't necessarily want to be an NREGA worker. You want a job more commensurate with your abilities, with your skills. So I think that really the push here, or the thing that will start, that will break the chain at its weakest link, is the availability of jobs. I think women will take them up. And that will start shifting the needle on many of these very sticky, and I think that's what happened in South Korea. That's certainly what happened in Europe. Family norms inside the home started to shift as women went out of the World War after the influenza pandemic, etc., etc. Whatever the factors were that pushed them into the labor market, that had then cascading effects inside the home as well. And even there, it's far from equal. I mean, women still do more work inside the home than men do. But it's more equal than India, of course.
Any other question? We may have maximum one more questions we can take. Yeah, Professor Chandrasekhar.
Thank you. I think I was waiting. Most of the, ideas have been captured, so I'm happy that. But I have two things. One is that specifically in some areas, we can't qualify that private schooling is better than government schooling, at least in some sectors. You see what is happening, that if you see the mechanism, if you have money, the son is wanted. If the son is not doing well in academics, the parents would put them in private schools. That is one mechanism. The second mechanism is that, so therefore we should not, maybe the data tells up to, as you said, up to age 19, but if you see higher education, I think somewhere need to test this hypothesis that girls are continue to do better, and that maybe as one is policy, as government policy. Second is that they continue to better and they continue to get the better education, which are generally public educations in higher education. So that's the, that is the kind of one hypothesis one need to test in future. Second is related to that question which you said that, that many parents observing that girls are supporting, and that would in longer run may not bring the son preference down, but it will bring the unwanted girls portion down. So what I would like to say, it is not complementary. Why it is not complementary? That the surveys, the way we ask questions is very important. Till NFHS 3, we were asking one set of question, the boys preference, that okay, then girl preference, and the particular child does, the sex does not matter. It was huge. Up to 2005-6, there's a large proportion of women saying that the sex does not matter for the next child. But then, NFHS 4 onward, we didn't see that, particular variable, and the way question is also asked, of course. We need to somewhere, like this is our assumptions that we make mixed family and we made daughter and son preference family, but there is a section for whom the sex does not matter. Hopefully that would be higher because of higher fertility in past, but somewhere we need to bring those into account in our survey and data analysis. So what Professor Unisa said, that even that women or girls who are not, we have done well in career taking care, is one way thinking, but other way thinking that should not motivate parents to say that should not be the reason only that they should have girl, but it would be the reason that they would also be doing equally good and they are doing even better if we invest same amount on them, because that is what experience comes. I know that one incident when I used to go from my hometown, Moradabad, from Delhi, 20-30 years back, it was very difficult to travel a girl, for even exam purpose in Delhi or for schooling or other things. Today, in Noida, whenever I go Friday, you see the trains are full of girls because they are working and it's 160 kilometers away only. So that's the opportunity. These parents see that they are doing well and hope that that would change the situations. I don't know how soon, but that will affect these preferences in near decades. Thank you.
Yeah, thank you, Professor Chandrasekhar. So quick responses. One is that you're absolutely right that there is no rule or guarantee that a private institution is better than a public institution. And I don't make that assumption also. It is more expensive than a public institution. That's a reality. And parents do distinguish in terms of expenditure between the girl and the boy. And all we were trying to see was whether this difference varies according to the type of family. So parents believe, and private institutions can be terrible. You know, there's a huge variability in private institutions, but there is still it is still considered a status symbol, and there are any number of field studies that document that, where people think that going to a private English medium school is sort of some symbol of higher quality, which may not at all be the truth. The public school could be just as good, the government school, right? So it is not that we are saying that private schools are better. We are just observing a difference in the expenditure. The second point is on the NFHS question, which explicitly asks this. We did look at that as well in our survey. First of all, the problem, not the problem, but because NFHS is not a purely educational survey, a lot of the questions that we found in the NSS survey are not, there are no counterparts in the NFHS. So you can't combine that data with this. Secondly, over time, the stated preferences are, as Professor MariBhat's one of his papers shows, over time, stated preferences become equal. So if you just look at parents' stated preferences, which could be the rationalization or social desirability bias, either of those things could be producing that. It would seem that virtually some preferences is eliminated. Parents seem to be equally happy when a surveyor asks with a girl and a boy, but on ground, we know that that's not the case. So we did, though, by the way, look at the stated preferences and see whether it's a difference between 1 child, 2 children, and 3 children families. We have done that, and it's in the appendix of our paper. So yeah, we are aware of that, but we couldn't replicate this analysis with NFHS because a lot of the outcome variables for education are missing from the NFHS survey. Yeah.
Okay,
Just
thank
a
you.
brief,
Thank you,
brief,
Dr.
brief, James, brief comment. I think it was very interesting. Let me tell you the way you have highlighted the, gender gap in terms of educational, in terms of quality, quantity also. That's one way of doing it. But most of the, because if you go for any kind of quantitative analysis, so we used to look at, the age, sex composition of the large families, small families, and bring him, in terms of quantitative, kind of linkages, etc. So those old concepts of dowry, old age security, post, death rituals, etc. I think those are getting, diluted now with urbanization and modernization. So, but post facto rationalization, when you're looking at 5 to 19, post facto rationalization becomes very important because that also becomes very difficult to classify your child into wanted or unwanted, boy or girl, whatever it is. So post facto rationalization concept probably is going to work, is going to affect, this classification in this age group. It may not be affecting too much for the younger children because there you can ask straight away question in the survey. But 5 to 19 possibly post facto. But this is a nice way of, analyzing the gender gaps in education. Similarly, we can do gender gaps in, level 4 participation also.
Yeah, so
kind of factors.
sorry to
So it is
interrupt you, Professor Gulati. In NSS, there is no question on preferences. NSS
Yeah, there is no
surveys don't
preference.
have any question on preferences. So we
I
are just
know that.
observing the family composition and then doing the classification. There
Yeah,
is nothing about
absolutely.
sex preference. Yeah.
No, it was interesting.
Absolutely, yeah. I think every data has its own limitation. We have to live with that data and then
Yeah.
see what all interpretations can be derived from this
Exactly.
data. I think that
Exactly.
way, I think it has been a wonderful paper which has been presented. I'm really happy that Dr. Ashwini, you have taken time out and then have given this memorial lecture. Thank you so much for this. Thank you all for participation as well. So
Thank
before
you
we
for
close,
inviting me.
now before we close officially, let me now invite Dr. Deepthi Govil to propose a formal vote of thanks. Over to you, Deepthi.
Respected Professor Ashwini Deshpande, Professor K.S.James, Professor T.V.Sekher, faculty colleagues, distinguished guests, and my dear participants. It's my pleasure to have been asked to propose a vote of thanks on the occasion of 14th Professor P.N.MariBhat Memorial Lecture. I, on behalf of Publication Cell, IIPS Mumbai, and on my personal behalf, extend a very hearty vote of thanks to all those who contributed to the success of this memorial lecture. At the onset, I would like to express my gratitude to Professor Ashwini Deshpande for happily accepting our invitation and sparing her valuable time to deliver 14th Professor P.N.MariBhat Memorial Lecture. We are very much privileged to have you with us, ma'am, today. Your thought-provoking and crisp lecture on Nakusha, son preference, unwanted girls, and gender gaps in education, a very peculiar issue to many Indian families, as really has enlightened us, many of us. So your talk actually highlighted concerns related to gender gaps in education using complex phenomena of unwanted girls from the lens of meta-son preference and fertility stopping rules. I believe that your talk has benefited all of us and gave a hint to explore more. Thank you once again, Professor Deshpande, for agreeing to be the part of this occasion in the found memory of Professor MariBhat. It's my profound duty to thank all the distinguished participants from the demographer's fraternity, as well as the different parts of the globe. I can see many of people have actually joined from the different parts. So for their, so all of you actually have actively participated, and there has been a dynamic and enriched discussion, which made the lecture a very grand success. We look forward for such enthusiastic participation in upcoming lectures. And thank you so much, everyone, once again, for being present today. I would like to thank Professor K.S.James, Director IIPS, to delegate us with the responsibility to organize this lecture. His support and valuable inputs have been immensely helpful. Very big thanks to Professor T.V.Sekher for organizing the lecture on behalf of Publication Cell IIPS Mumbai. Under his able leadership and initiative, we will be getting the opportunity to hear many more scholarly scholars. My heartiest gratitude to the staff of Publication Cell, Dr. Vaidilingam and Ms. Irene Solomon, to extend their timely logistic support in organizing this lecture. Thank you, team, for providing all the necessary support and enabling environment to make this lecture possible. I extend my thanks to the personnel from ICT unit, Mr. Anjani and Mr. Avinash and the team for providing their technical support in organizing this lecture. And now all of us have actually become very much accustomed to WebEx, and I wonder that we will be definitely missing WebEx when we go offline. So I can't thank enough everyone for their involvement and their willingness to take on the completion of the task beyond their comfort zone. Thank you so much, everybody, once again for attending the lecture. Thank you so much.
Thank you. That comes to the end of today's lecture. Thank you so much for once again, and bye-bye.